Welcome to the first Bristol University Press webinar of our autumn series. I'm Catherine King, Marketing Manager, and I'm delighted to introduce Pat Thomson, author of School Scandals Blowing the Whistle on the Corruption of Our Education System, which was published yesterday. Pat is Professor of Education at the University of Nottingham. She was previously a head teacher and senior public servant in the Australian school system. Pat will talk for 20 minutes and then I'll be asking your questions. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat. Details of how to order Pat's book will be available here too. I'm now going to hand over to Pat.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you everybody for joining me today to hear a little bit about this book that I've managed to produce. I'm just switching myself to my desktop, and you should now be able to see slides, which is infinitely better than watching me on the full screen. So people have often asked me how I got to write this book and how it started. And in the recent past, a couple of people have focused on the fact that I collected quite a lot of media clips, and people have been fascinated by this number, 3,800, which I've listed. And as I often say, you know, actually it's miles more than that now. Because I've kept collecting, and indeed there are ongoing instances of the kinds of things that I talk about in the book. But I got interested, I guess, in the sort of headlines that I could see. Okay, so I can now not move my paper. There I can. Goodness me. Okay, slight technical hitch. So I got really interested in headlines that I was seeing literally in newspapers, that I was reading online, about things that were happening in schools. And of course, first of all, I noticed headlines that were like, if I was collecting now, I might start by looking at these. The A-level fiasco that we've just been through, where we can see the government doing its current kind of thing. It's going into an immediate announcement of how fantastic, what a wonderful job they've done, and then a defensive kind of position, and then a denial of all the problems that there might be. And in this particular case, a change, and that doesn't always happen, but a change in policy and a U-turn, as people have called it. And now, of course, we're into the blame game as we actually try and find out what happened. But of course, accompanying these media headlines has been quite a lot of analysis by people trying to explain how it is that this particular situation came to be. And the explanations vary from the kind of technical processes of looking at the technical processes of the algorithm itself, what Boris Johnson called the mutant algorithm, as if mutants didn't have a kind of human progenitor somewhere. And to looking at the kind of the way in which the assessment system works, and the way in which the assessment system does and doesn't measure what it purports to measure, and it's not really meritocratic in the way that some people think it is, to explanations about the increased role of data in education, to explanations about the kind of inequitable education system that we have, which kind of mirrors the inequitable society we have, where educational success seems to be closely tied to the kind of thickness of your family's wallet. So you can see all these kind of explanations around at the moment. It's very hard to actually present a kind of a coherent explanation, really, because it's possible to take these various angles, and all of them, in fact, are right. And so being able to explain the complexity of what appear to be, you know, on the face of it, just quite simple debacles, becomes pretty complicated. And so that's really where I ended up with the book. I ended up with this set of events that I was looking at, with the issue of how it is they might be explained. And the first thought really that came into my mind was that we were looking at, in some instances, cases of corruption. Now, I know corruption's a really emotive word, and I really worried about using it for quite some time, and whether, you know, it was appropriate in an educational context. And so I started to read about corruption to see whether in fact it was appropriate. You know, as I learnt, as I engaged with the literatures on corruption, it's a pretty old idea, and it goes, you know, way back to the Greeks. It goes through, its lineage goes through Christianity, it goes through Machiavelli, it comes through Marx. You know, it's a kind of an idea which has been around for a long time, but also it's changed over time as well. So if we think, for example, about something like Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, you know, where part of the plot hangs around the engagement of the merchant in usury or money lending, and money lending was seen as being, you know, a corrupt activity and immoral. And if we skip forwards to today, we have an entire banking industry that's based around the notion of lending money. But of course, in the meantime, what's happened is that there's been a kind of not only an approval of money lending, it's changed from being something immoral to being something that's acceptable, but it's acceptable within limits. So there are ways of regulating and legitimating particular kinds of interest rates, for example, and people who aren't part of institutions, but who are the kind of the dodgy person who lends money when they ought not, that's still considered illegal. So you can see that it's a term which doesn't have a fixed meaning. It's very situated in particular times and particular places, and what counts as corruption in one place isn't necessarily seen as corruption in another. But it's also got this kind of dual lineage, if you like, because while corruption, as we understand it, is about, you know, somebody benefiting, a person or a group benefiting from some act when they ought not to. So it covers things like fraud, bribery, and cronyism and nepotism. There is this older kind of definition sits alongside that legal definition of corruption. And so while instances like this particular headline, which appeared, you know, very recently this week, about two head teachers who've now finally, we might say, actually being banned from running any more schools after being found guilty of pretty serious fraud and inappropriate what are called related party transactions, which is where you pay somebody, your nearest and dearest, to actually do something and they benefit and you don't go through any kind of due process. I mean, you know, while there are some clear instances of corruption, there are also a lot of cases where it's a bit grayer. It's not quite clear whether it's legal corruption or whether it's just what I initially called bad behaviour. And, you know, it's a kind of instance where you think something might be on the nose, but you're not quite sure. And, you know, here are a couple of very recent examples where we've got, you know, and this kind of story is absolutely rife during the pandemic, isn't it? We've got a firm linked to Govan Cummings hired to work with Ofqual on A levels, you know, so how did they get this job? What process was gone through? We actually know under the pandemic there's very little process, in fact, because under emergency powers, government can give contracts to whoever they want. And of course, it's the kind of removal of due process, which allows for what could be dodgy, what appear at first sight to be dodgy decisions to be actually made. And here we've also got another one here about trusts, an academy trust looking at being stripped of its 4 schools because of fears of malpractice. So, and the word malpractice, of course, raises concerns about whether this is actual corruption or whether it's just marginally within the bounds of legality, but actually is still not acceptable. It's unethical behaviour, it's poor practice, it's malpractice. So this sort of second stream, there's a second stream, historical stream of thinking about corruption, which is the one that really came through from the Greeks, which is, it means actually that the state isn't working properly. The state is sick, it's not doing the best for its citizens. There are administrative practices that just aren't doing the kind of job that they're meant to do. And when I was thinking about this in the book, I think I initially thought I was going to go big C and little c corruption. And then for a long time, I talked about corrupted practices as bad behaviour. But that seemed a little bit too twee and a little bit lighthearted, actually, for the kind of activities that might come into the idea of a corrupted practice. And this is the term that I ended up with. It's actually not a kind of particularly well-known phrase. Perhaps it's something that might be helpful to people now when we think about practices that are actually in some way dubious. And we can see here a kind of, again, another reasonably recent news clip about the DfE just not being transparent about who's got COVID-related contracts. And this, I think, kind of violates one of the expectations we have of government, that it's going to be transparent in its business. In fact, you know, putting it bluntly, it's going to tell us what it's done with our tax money. And we're not going to be left wondering why some people were given a contract and others weren't. So the kinds of things that could come into a corrupted practice are pretty broad, and you have to think about where the boundary actually is. Where is something a corrupted practice, and where is it just, you know, absolutely appalling management? And I've tended to be, in the book, I've tended to be fairly broad, and I've tended to say that these kinds of examples where, you know, schools are going to get 10 COVID testing kits, or schools are going to have extreme difficulty actually making the school lunch vouchers system work, or schools are going to be receiving in November the laptops that might have been helpful back in April, or schools aren't going to be accessed until nearly the end of the year, the kind of tutoring help that's been promised. That some of these things are in some way a result of a state system that actually isn't working properly, and it has been corrupted or eroded or corroded in this sense of being the kind of being eaten away in some sense and somehow. And it's that some sense and somehow that I try and explain in the book. But one of the tests, I think, for me, of whether something is a corrupt practice is whether it ends up with a kind of perverse outcome. So it ends up with an outcome that very clearly isn't in the interests, the best interests of most of the people in the school system. And I mean that in a kind of broader sense. So I'm including families and communities there as well. And you can see a clip there that, you know, there's sometimes it's way in which funding is allocated. So here's an example of funding which was meant to actually even things out, actually ended up benefiting the very people who it wasn't intended to benefit in the first place. And so there's a kind of, it's an important example because it points to the fact that actually good intentions are not what matter when we're thinking about a corroded practice. It's actually what happens as a result of it that matters. So it doesn't matter if a minister says, oh, I love the arts, I didn't mean these changes in curriculum to mean that people wouldn't do the arts. That's not my fault. It's actually the outcome that's the issue. And it doesn't matter if somebody says, well, you know, this school performance measure wasn't meant to mean that the school involved and enrolled a whole lot of students in English as a second language when they're all first language speakers. I mean, I didn't want that to happen. So, and that's the school's fault. It's nothing to do with the system. But the issue here is that, you know, these are structures which have outcomes, and if they have perverse and contrary incentives within them, then the problem is never simply that of the person or the body that respond. You know, what at the end it's also about the system which produces that kind of perverse outcome. And I think what we can see in the kind of an indication of the fact that we've got a lot of kind of perverse outcomes, secrecy, obscure, opaque kind of processes, decision making being made by a few people, not involving a lot of people, information being withheld, perhaps due diligence not being carried out. We can see, I think, by the number of complaints that there are that are now made to try about the system. And I mean, if we looked at special education, for example, that, you know, that's an area which is always I think contentious, but the number of complaints are just increasing exponentially. If we look at the number of requests that there are under freedom of information, appeals against processes, these are all kind of symptomatic. If the culture of an organisation is one in which there are a lot of complaints, appeals, and legal requests for information, then you have to think there's something going on in the system that is actually problematic and is not working as well as it might, and is perhaps not working in the public interest, which I think is the kind of key issue that I try and deal with in the book. And I think the other thing that we can see at the moment is the important role of both the law and the press. I mean, if we understand the state to have these kind of institutions that are meant to kind of counterbalance each other, we can actually see at the moment the importance that the law has, and also the role of the press. And of course, the press is, you know, the fourth estate are various. You know, there's some terrible press, obviously, that go around and tap people's phones and deal in a lot of disinformation, but there are also, I think, elements of the press that are incredibly important at the moment, and they really are one of the ways in which we actually find out what's going on. And in fact, I've dedicated the book to education journalists because I rely heavily in the book on the kinds of investigative journalism that they do. I've got a little ad there for Warwick Mansell and his subscription, a journalist service that you can look at. Warwick's constantly kind of investigating what's happening, and it's important that we have these, because without the capacity to actually mount legal challenges and also to get information through the press, we really not know as much as we do at present, and there's still a lot of things that we don't know. So in the book, I try and deal with the kind of issue really of how did we get here? And I take a funny little kind of historical turn really, and I trying to understand in a kind of, I guess, what Raymond Williams would have called the long revolution. You know, how has this actually happened? So I do go right back to, in terms of schooling, go back to the formation of the public education system. I kind of look at Sidney Webb, and Sidney Webb, you know, wrote a couple of reports around the turn of the century on the school system in England and in London in particular, and it has amazing resonance today because he talks about an education muddle. He talks about an education system which is fragmented, and he talks about an incredible waste of public money, and he talks about what he calls decent efficiency, and what he makes is a kind of very strong connection between what he calls decent efficiency and equity. So he says if you don't have a school system which runs decently and efficiently, then it just leads to enormous inequities in provision. And certainly in the kind of history of schooling, you know, what he suggested, of course, and came to be was the local authority system, which was in force, you know, really for a very long time this last century, but towards the end of the century has been overtaken by, you know, a kind of counter revolution, I guess, as Jim McGuigan would say, you know, that that has fragmented and changed the kind of school structure that we have. And I spend a fair bit of time in the book talking about the funder purchaser provider system and what that's actually done, and what it's also done within the civil service as well as within schools. Because when I'm talking about the school system, I really want to include the civil service in it as well, that it's part of the way in which a public service is actually enacted, is through both a civil service and it's the middle tier of schooling and the schools themselves. And so I spend a fair bit of time explaining how that happened and the changes in the civil service as well. And I argue that as well, that, you know, there are conversations over the years as these kind of changes started to happen within schooling. We also stopped talking a lot about what schooling was for. And, you know, this is a quote from Raymond Williams. And I've had, as an Australian living in the UK, I've had a great deal of pleasure going back and engaging with some of this kind of history. And you know, Williams talks in particular about the way in which education has become perverted, really, so that the emphasis has become on getting the skills and knowledge, as opposed to actually thinking about what those skills and knowledge might actually be used for. And I think that's a particularly important question in the book. And I think it's become a question which has become on really in most people's minds, I think, during the pandemic. And as we become aware of what's happening in the world, as we look at the Amazon burning, as we look at large swathes of the United States burning to a crisp, just as it did in Australia over summer last year. And we have to think about, you know, the kinds of global challenges that we have now. I think the pandemic's made us realise that we are all interconnected. We're not, you know, completely in charge of the world in the way we might like to have thought that we were, that we're vulnerable as a species. And actually we need to be able to rethink what it is that we do, and therefore what it is and how it is we're actually educating the next generation. And I think there are a lot of people, there's a kind of, I sense a kind of increasing demand for bigger conversations, not simply about what subjects we're going to teach, but actually the kinds of things that we think young people need to know going into this very uncertain and highly likely to be very risky future. So in the book, I think the kind of case that I make really, and this is my kind of finishing point really, that I kind of argue that we have to redefine what we understand as efficiency in an organisational sense. So efficiency has come, so we need to go back a bit to, you know, people like Sidney Webb. So efficiency is not necessarily about the cheapest way to do something or the most exploitative way to do something. It actually, it seems to me, in a kind of a finite world, it's about not being wasteful. It's not being wasteful of people's energy, of people's time, of the staff that we actually use, not being wasteful of public money. That's incredibly important. And unfortunately, the system we have at the moment has got a bunch of new inefficiencies built into it. We've built in terrible payments for PFI. We've built in the cost of conversion to academies. We've built in the cost of re-brokerage. There are a number of problems, of costs that we've got that we don't necessarily want to be keep paying for, I think. And I think also we need to redefine effectiveness, so that an effective system is not simply one that, you know, you can say gets a lot of points on standardized tests. It's got to be, if something is effective, it's got to go some way towards a more equitable society, a more equitable kind of distribution of educational benefits. And education obviously works with other public goods. It doesn't work by itself. It's connected. We can see during the pandemic the way that schooling is connected to work, is connected to homes in ways that often perhaps haven't been as strongly to the fore. And I think effectiveness also has to be about, you know, in Sydney Webb's term, decent government. You know, it's got to be about government which has got some kind of morals and ethics, which doesn't rely on spin and lies and cheating and hiding in order to actually get the job done. And it's got to, I think, we've got to have a kind of strong sense of public good. And this is more than individuals having an ethical code. That's part of producing public good, but public good is more than simply being able to measure the distribution of public goods. It's actually a kind of remoralisation about what a public policy agenda, including schooling, is about. And it's also, as part of that, got to kind of address the democratic deficit, or the increasing lack of ways in which people are able to make their opinions heard at present. So part of whatever we do, I argue, has to address the kind of involvement of a lot more people, not simply, I mean, teachers and students and families, but other people who also care about what education is about. So that's the book. I think probably I'll stop there and just hand back to Catherine and see if anybody wants to ask any questions. Sorry, I've used up nearly all the time.
Thank you very much, Pat. That was really interesting and fascinating, and I really enjoyed your slides as well. So thank you so much for that. We have got some questions. We have a little bit of time just for some questions, and they're all coming in now. So I'll get on with them straight away so we can get through as many as possible. First of all, I have a question from Stephen Parker, who says, "Hi Pat, it's Steve. Although promoted as an innovative way forward in teaching, I've noticed that academies haven't been discussed much in the news about education and COVID-19. Maybe the media has just lumped schools together, but I'm surprised that academies haven't been more vocal about providing innovative approaches to dealing with COVID. Do you think they've had to depend on long-standing structures, e.g. local authorities or non-academy schools, to manage COVID?"
I don't actually know the answer to this, and I hope that the kind of research that is done during the COVID period does produce some of this evidence. But my hunch would be that academies have actually been relatively well placed because they've kind of got an infrastructure. And I certainly know from conversations with people who are academy heads that I know, that they've actually been frustrated by central government taking away things that they could actually do better themselves. So the school lunch vouchers is a really good example, I think, where large academies, who are nearly as large as some local authorities, were actually able to organise school vouchers themselves, but then, and they did it extremely efficiently and quickly, and actually they could have extended that to other schools adjacent to them, and I think they would have if there had already been that kind of collaboration between academies and other schools in the area, and there may be a few that actually did do that in some instances, but I think they were really frustrated by central government just rolling over with its dodgy kind of and highly inefficient at first and inequitable kind of scheme. But I think the other thing is that, of course, a lot of local authorities don't have much capacity. They don't have much money now, and they don't have the same kind of infrastructure that they had 20 years ago. So I think there is the kind of middle tier of how things get done is particularly muddled, just as it was in Sydney Webb's day. I mean, we've got kind of regional schools commissioners who can do certain things, but they haven't got a kind of infrastructure really to speak of. And we've got very emaciated local authorities in a lot of instances who would do more if they could. And we've got academies which often have quite solid infrastructures, which some might actually be prepared to share with other people and to actually work with the local authority. And in a few instances, I think they do over particular kinds of practices like managing students excluded from school. So I think it's just been incredibly difficult, and I think people on the ground have just worked incredibly hard to make things happen in really difficult circumstances.
Yes, absolutely. It's depressing, isn't it, how little progress we've made since Sydney Webb's day. Moving on to a question from Susan Coles. She says, the link between English education and political ideology is a marriage of corruption possibilities. We now have such a well-established, sustainable, corrupt hierarchy that people seem to just look shocked but don't challenge. Have we given up as a nation?
Look, I think this is, I mean, I have this conversation myself over my dinner table, breakfast table, all the time. You know, why is it that this is what we've come to expect and believe that this is acceptable? And I think that's partly why I'm kind of arguing for a sort of remoralisation, because I think with a remoralisation comes a much stronger sense of outrage and a sense that actually we've got to get organised, and we can't rely on the machinery of government, particularly in its current form, to actually do this for us. And I think in the book, together with a range of other people, I think there is a kind of argument that what we need to do is use whatever public forums we actually do have to kind of get together and get organised and try and do something. But we also have to make some new ones. We have to forge new alliances and actually do probably some kind of innovative things, you know, people's juries, commissions, and, you know, whatever means we can actually find that will create a space where we can have sustained conversations. And I think it's important that, you know, people are able to protest, but we need to be able to do more than protest. We actually need to be able to share ideas and have ongoing discussions, I think, about what we want instead. We don't necessarily, as I say in the book, we don't necessarily want to go back to what we had before. You know, I'm not, you know, sort of starry-eyed about what we had in the 60s and 70s, which were highly inequitable for young people. You know, we've got to go forward and get out of, I think, some of the kind of messes that we're in now.
Absolutely. Katie Huxley asks, to what extent do you feel the findings of your study of the English system are valid for the devolved nations that have not adopted some of the policies of England?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things is that, you know, it's this form of government that we have, this kind of form of government, you know, which Osborne and Gabler, for example, talk about as steering, not rowing, is not simply confined to conservative governments. It's taken up by governments of all descriptions, and we can certainly find instances, I think, of some of the kinds of things that I'm talking about in a range of different locations. It's not simply a question of England. I mean, the closest comparison is probably the United States, where you can certainly see sort of terrible corruption and a lot of corrupted practice going on in relation to charter schooling, for example, massive amounts of money drifting. But, you know, and in other countries like Sweden, where, you know, there's been kind of major collapses of private providers, and that's sort of one of the risks involved in devolving, you know, the kind of a purchaser provider contracted system, is that once you start getting private providers into the mix, they're profit oriented. We know this from the railway system. They're not always particularly efficient. They're often very costly, and they go broke, you know. And I think we can see that as I said, in Sweden, there's been a major childcare provider go bust in Australia. I think you can see bits and pieces of these kinds of politics playing out in lots of different places. And obviously all of them are specific. Arguably, England is one of the places where it's most realised, and it's why it's such an interesting example.
Absolutely. I think we've got time for one more question, which is from Dennis Sims, who says, I know you're very knowledgeable about exclusions and alternative provision. What are your thoughts on public funds being funneled into private alternative provision? Is there a danger of corruption there?
Well, I think the inherent risks in the kind of funder purchaser provider system is that they proliferate the number of points at which the public and private come together. And so there's a lot of opportunity for people to do dodgy things or downright illegal things if they want to. There's also just the risk of people not being able to continue. And I think it's certainly the case in the alternative provision area, and the research that I've done in this area suggests that, it's kind of mixed economy does lead to, for instance, some providers actually going under, some providers doing things on the cheap, and actually exploiting, for example, their staff in order to actually provide a service. And it is an area, I think, which requires regulation. I mean, you can't have any kind of public provision if you're concerned about waste. If you want to be decent, you've got to have some kind of regulation. But the question is, what kind of regulation do you have? We have, for example, in schools, we have a really punitive kind of regulation system that we need to think about. Is punishment the best way to actually get people to do the right thing? In the alternative provision area, we've actually got a lack of regulation. And what it means, of course, is that it generally falls to schools, and in some cases local authorities, to take the responsibility for checking out the kind of quality and propriety of the services that they contract for their students. So I think it's it's an area that concerns me a lot.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Pat. And I think we're going to have to leave the questions there. I'm sorry if you asked a question that we didn't have a chance to put to Pat. So I'd just like to say to everybody, thank you for joining us at this Bristol University Press webinar today, and particularly to our speaker, Pat Thomson. Details of how to order Pat's book, School Scandals, are available in the chat. Our next webinar is on the 24th of September with Keith Dowding, author of It's the Government, Stupid. Please see our social media or website for details. Thank you.